I have to admit, it must have worked in some way somehow, because I was elected to 3 terms in Congress. The most notable of which was when, in 1830, I opposed Andrew Jackson's Indian Removal Bill. And for those of you who may not have heard of this piece of information, well, it's as simple as this. It proposed to remove the civilized tribes from the eastern states to west of the Mississippi, to lands that they were not familiar with. Well, I sure for one couldn't stand for that. When I looked over this bill, I stood up on the floor of Congress and I spoke out again. I said, Mr. Speaker, fellow members of the Congress of these United States, I've stood before you a good many times in fights and fun. And we've had a laugh or two for the good of the country and our own digestion. But now you can fold up your grins and put them away, or you'll hear no jokes from David Crockett today. You have something here before you called an engine bill. I don't aim to keep you here much longer arguing about it. You've had enough of that already. But before it comes to a vote, I just want to remind you of something. Expansion is a mighty fine thing. Sure, we gotta grow, but not at the expense of the things this nation was founded to protect. You wouldn't be doing the settlers no favors voting for this bill. You'd only be making rich men out of land grabbers and speculators. And they're a no-count lot about as natural as flies around a molasses barrel. This here godforsaken bill is little more than a matter of the head and not the heart. And my head is telling me that I cannot go nor follow there. And in fact, if I'm the only man in the whole of my district, much less this nation, to vote against this unjust measure, I will gladly do so. And I believe it is a choice that will not make me ashamed to stand before the throne of judgment at the end of my days. Well, unfortunately, despite all that fine speaking, it passed. At that point, I had committed what them folks up in Washington called political suicide, because I'd opposed Andrew Jackson. And I don't know if you folks have met Old Hickory, but I'll tell you one thing right now, whether it comes to politics or battle, you don't oppose him. Because if you do, he's going to paint a mighty big target on your back. Sure enough, that's what happened to me. Because from that point on, every year come re-election, why, he'd try and get hand-picked candidates to knock my nose out of joint. But I wasn't going to take this lying down, no sir. As a matter of fact, my last political opponent was a one-legged cuss by the name of Adam Huntsman, a veteran of the Same Creek War that I'd been a part of. And now, mind you, Huntsman, he had seen some of the fighting and had lost one of his legs and replaced it with a wooden one. And so he tried to use that as a symbol of courage and faith to the American cause. I, on the other hand, used it to my own advantage in a whole other manner. Because as I previously stated, traveling along the backwoods on the campaign trails, we always did everything together, which included stopping at the farm of this one prominent farmer who allowed us to stay the night there. Now, while we was talking to this farmer, I happened to notice that he had a somewhat lovely daughter, and I noticed Huntsman was eyeing her as well. At that point, I began to formulate an idea in my mind because I knowed Huntsman to be a womanizer. So that night, when everyone was sound asleep, I got up in a little more than my stocking feet and grabbed a hold of a chair. Now, folks, I'm going to have to ask you to imagine that this here's a chair. And what I'd done was I put my one knee up in the chair, and I'd walk. And every time I'd walk, I'd put the chair down first, and then step. And chair, step, to where it sounded like old Huntsman with his peg leg walking along the floor. And then I got right to the daughter's door and started jiggling on the handle, and she woke up screaming for her paw, and I took back as quick as I could, imitating the same sound of Huntsman running away on his peg leg. Well, sure enough, the farmer, he burst in through the door, demanding an explanation. And of course, wouldn't you know it, he woke me up out of a dead sleep. Well, when he woke me up out of that sleep I was enjoying, I intervened as a peacemaker. And I told that farmer, I said, I do apologize for my opponent's actions here, but I tell you what you do. If you not only vote for me, but convince your friends to vote for me, I guarantee you won't have to worry about him or the likes of him ever again in Congress. But unfortunately, for all my tricks, I was beaten by Huntsman, whether or not the farmer voted for me. And at that point, when I found out that the votes were counted and I'd lost, I was just disgusted. I'd had a belly full and I was done. So I started looking elsewhere for a brand fire new start. Unfortunately, thanks to the aid of my friend Sam Houston, he told me about this place out west they called the Texas, wherein if a man signed on for citizenship, he could receive a sizable grant of land. I figured, why not? Now, I've heard about this Texas Revolution they got going on down there, but I ain't too worried about it none because, well, from what I've told, by the time I get down there, all the fighting's going to be over with. So I figured, what have I got to do? Go down there, sign on citizenship, receive my land, build a cabin, and bring my family out. But whatever's going to happen when I get across the Red River into Texas, I ain't rightly sure. Matter of fact, I've never been down there before. But I will say, like in so many cases, I've had to learn to just let go and trust the hands of Providence to guide me as best it could. But when I get down to Texas, if I'm to make a fortune for myself and a new life, or if I'm to meet my end at the era of a Comanche or a bullet of a Mexican, well, I'll leave this for others for at least when I'm dead. And that's always be sure you're right. And go ahead. Well, folks, this concludes the story of David Crockett's life to a certain degree, because as I'm sure many of you know, there's a little bit more to it. We know that after Crockett left Tennessee on November 1st, 1835, he made his way down to Texas. But of course, I would be remiss if I didn't tell you this one particular story, which gives one of the most famous quotes that's associated with him. You see, right before he got down across the Mississippi, he stopped over in Memphis, Tennessee at McCool's Tavern. And while he was there, he treated the house to a whole round of drinks. And shortly after, he gets up on the bar of the tavern and he says, "My friends, constituents, or others, you all know me and I know you. You know my platform, and it's as simple as this, because I told it to you many a times. And that is, if you was to see fit to re-elect me, well, I'd go up there to Washington and represent you as honest as I could. But you all have seen fit to throw in your support for that man with a timber toe to succeed me. Well, that being said, you may all go to hell. I'm going to Texas." And sure enough, he did. Now, when he got down to Texas in early December of 1835, he found himself at Nacogdoches, where he signed on, not for the oath of citizenship, because believe it or not, he just narrowly missed the window to sign on. So the next best thing for it was that he signed on the oath of militia for 6 months, and the completion of which he would receive 640 acres of his own choosing. Now, from Nacogdoches, Crockett and others, under the command of Captain William B. Harrison and his mounted riflemen, they went to Washington on the Brazos, wherein their forces divided, some heading to the Rio Grande, and others to San Antonio, the Alamo. Now, when they got down there, no one was concerned about the Mexican threat, because they figured that they had put such a whipping on General Coss and his troops so bad that Santa Anna would be a fool to try and come back. They also figured that he would be a madman to try and march his army over 300 miles in the dead of winter. Well, unfortunately for them, Santa Anna was that madman, and that's exactly what happened. But the night before Santa Anna and his troops took the town of San Antonio de Bayard, on February 22nd, the men of the town were having a fandango to celebrate George Washington's birthday. And come next morning, when the town was eerily quiet, most of the men trying to sleep off all what they had drank the night before, well, a lone sentry in the bell tower of the San Fernando Cathedral, he spots something off in the distance, a flash of steel in the sun. Surely, he thinks, this can't be. And he rings the alarm bell, and Colonel Travis comes out to find out what's going on, and he sends out 2 riders and says, "Boys, if it's what we fear it is, y'all come riding back hell-bent for leather." And much to his chagrin, that's what they done, leaving nothing more than a cloud of dust. But when they got back there with the electrifying news that the enemy was at the gates, they went back across the San Antonio River to hold themselves up in the Alamo. Well, believe it or not, despite Santa Anna being that madman that I told you about, he did in fact try to negotiate with them, and Colonel Travis and Bowie tried to negotiate back and forth. But they couldn't reach an agreement, and so in an act of defiance, Colonel Travis fires off the 18-pound cannon towards the town. And in retaliation, Santa Anna hangs the blood-red flag of no quarter from the Church of Bayard, in token that the war is now one of vengeance. No prisoners and no mercy. And thus begins the siege of the Alamo, a 12-day siege which wore down the defenders, not only physically but mentally. Because throughout the day, they were being bombarded and had to keep their heads down. And throughout the night, while the Mexican soldiers were mostly sound asleep, they had to go out and repair the damage done to their walls, as well as try and retrieve firewood and water for the fort's dwindling supply. And it even began to affect David Crockett, who began to grumble and said that, "I would rather march out and fight in the open. I don't like to be hemmed up." Well, unfortunately, he wasn't going to get his wish, because towards the latter part of the siege, various couriers had come back, including one who was Colonel Travis's cousin, James Bonham, who informed them that Colonel Phantom was not going to be coming to their aid. But old 3-legged Willie, Robert Williamson, was going to be trying to muster up 600 volunteers to go reinforced the men of the Alamo. And in the P.S. of Williamson's letter, he encouraged Colonel Travis, for God's sake, hold out. Colonel Travis, he wasn't too sure what was going to happen. He figured if the worst comes to worst, we might as well fight and sell our lives dearly. And so, as the legend puts it, Colonel Travis called the men of the Alamo together. And he pulls out his saber, again, use your imagination. He pulls out his sword and draws a line in the sand and asks any of those who are willing to fight and possibly die for the cause of Texas independence to step over that line. Needless to say, just about everyone did, including Jim Bowie, who was sick in his cot, and he was asked to be carried over. But the one fellow they said never crossed over was a Frenchman named Moses Rose. And before you go harping on Mr. Rose for not wanting to fight because he's a Frenchman, I'll go ahead and tell you right now that ain't the case. Because Mr. Rose was a veteran of the Napoleonic campaigns over in Europe. And he had seen warfare of this type before and knew what was coming. So when he was asked why he didn't want to stay and fight, he shrugged his shoulders and said, "I'm not ready to die yet. I've come here to live profitably, not die gloriously." And off he went into the history books. But in the pre-dawn hours of March 6, 1836, Santa Anna began to put his battle plan into action, with the different divisions all surrounding the compound known as the Alamo. And at around 5:30 that morning, a Mexican soldier who had been forced to wait for hours in the cold darkness finally snapped and started shouting, "Viva Santa Anna! Viva la República! Long live Santa Anna, and long live the Republic!" And now that the element of surprise was lost, Santa Anna ordered that the deguello be blown and that the men advance. Now, despite being caught off guard, the men of the Alamo did in fact put up a pretty stiff resistance, repelling the enemy twice from their walls. But finally, along the north wall where Colonel Travis was killed, they began to make their way into the compound. Now, the men of the north wall, they started pulling back across the compound to the long barracks. But in doing so, as they were barricading themselves in, they had made a fatal mistake because they had forgot to discharge their artillery atop the ramparts. And now, the Mexican soldiers turned the Texians' own cannons on them, blasted open the doors, and rushed into the long barracks. And within a matter of minutes, they had turned the place into a slaughterhouse. And with the same bloodlust, they went up into the convento, the infirmary, to shoot, stab, and bayonet those who were laying sick and wounded in their bed. And then they began to pour through the compound like ants. Finally, they made their way to the low barracks, where Jim Bowie was laying ill in bed. Now, some sources say that Jim Bowie was so sick that he was already dead by the time they got in there. Other sources say that if he was lucky, he might have at least got off 2 shots with his pistols before they were on him, and they stabbed him while he lay there in bed, hoisted him up, and paraded him around as a trophy of war. But the one defender of the Alamo, whose death still causes debate even to this day, is the death of David Crockett. Because we have many sources stating that he died during the fighting, and other sources stating that he was possibly captured along with several others before being brought before Santa Anna and then swiftly executed. But regardless of that, whether he died during the fighting or was executed in front of the general, right before the smoke had even begun to clear from the Battle of the Alamo, Santa Anna walks in and surveys the scene of carnage and laughs and passes it off as little more than a small affair. And militarily speaking, he was right. The Battle of the Alamo, lasting only 90 minutes, was a small affair. But it was that small affair that would light a fire in the hearts of the Texian patriots. A fire that would erupt on the plains of San Jacinto in April of 1836, when the forces under General Houston completely decimated Santa Anna's army in 18 minutes. And as the Texian and Tejano forces charged across the field, the cry on everyone's lips was, "Remember Goliad and remember the Alamo." And of course we remember the Alamo to this day. But it's also important to remember the men who fought and died on both sides of the conflict for the causes that they believed in. We certainly remember men like Captain Dickinson, Jim Bonner, Colonel Bowie, Colonel Travis, and of course we remember David Crockett. Thank you very much.